This is part two of Socialism and Counter-Revolution in Chile. And as I was mentioning, Frei was very successful, but the end of Frei's term really left the country as a center-to-center left country. And in fact, this was reflected in the three main candidates for the presidency. The first was Salvador Allende, who ran on a ticket called Popular Unity. There's a new addition to this group. So you've got the three parties that had made up the Popular Front and his earlier attempts, the Socialists, the Communists, the Radicals. And keep in mind, the Radicals are a middle-class, moderate party. And the fourth one is the MIR. And the MIR stands for the Movimiento Izquierda Revolucionario. You don't need to know that. That's why it's not on the screen, which is the left revolutionary movement. This was the radical left. These were people who talked about armed rebellion. They were very influenced by Che and to a lesser extent Fidel. And they were willing to participate in elections, but they were the real wild card. They were what people feared from the left. So that's the left candidate, Allende. The right-wing candidate is Arturo Alessandri, who comes from an old conservative family and who had been president in the 1950s. And the third candidate from Eduardo Frei's party is a Christian Democrat named Radomiro Tomic. Now, Tomic was a very liberal Christian Democrat. So really what you had here was the liberal left under Allende and the liberal center under Tomic and the unabashed right under Allende. And once again, it was another close election. But Allende, in fact, won. He won, as you can see, 36.3% to Alessandri's 34.9. Now, that's very close, but what many people say is, look, Tomic was fairly liberal, and Tomic stood for many of the same things that Allende did. So we can look at that vote as really, if we combine Tomic and Allende the way in 1964 the conservatives and the centrists went together, if you took the centrists and the liberals, you would see there's a real mandate for Unidad Popular. But there's something funny about these statistics you need to know, which is in the Chilean constitution, it says that you cannot be president unless you get a majority of the vote. Now, the last election, Frei did get a majority, but in 58, there was not a majority by Alessandri. So what happens? Well, the way the Constitution says is what you do is, if no one has a majority, then the Congress has to declare a winner. And it was traditional that whoever had had the most votes would simply be named. But the United States was so incredibly worried about Allende that it worked behind the scenes to try to change things. And what it tried to do was convince as many conservative and Christian Democratic members of Congress to not vote for Allende, to say, what we're going to do is we are going to name the president of the Senate as president. He would serve for one day, he would resign, and then Frei would be allowed to run for election. You could have multiple terms in Chile, but they could not be consecutive. And the idea was Frei was so popular that he would easily beat Allende. This was a kind of clever idea by the United States, but it offended Chilean sense of democracy. They said, no, we believe very strongly in the democratic system. We've never done something like this before. So even some very conservative members of the Congress voted to make Allende president in order to protect the ideals of Chilean democracy. Now, when Allende took power in 1970, he had a minority of the members of Congress. So early on, he tried to do whatever he could through the existing framework. What do I mean by that? Well, there were a series of laws all the way from Marmaduke Grovi, if you remember his 12-day socialist republic in the early 30s, through the Popular Front, through Frei, that had called for some more radical change, but never were implemented, particularly the things by Frei. And so what Allende and his administrators did is they took every existing law they could find that they liked and implemented it. They used the tools that they had to have an agrarian reform, to have some changes in mine ownership and taxation, and they had a radical tax reform that really did try to change the nature of equality and inequality. But this really angered opposition groups. And one of the things that became clear is that during the Allende years, there were lots of strikes, and these are pro-Allende strikers. But there was also increasing opposition from three main groups. First of all, from the most powerful, wealthiest people in Chile, the oligarchy. They did not like Allende one bit. They didn't like what he stood for and what he was doing. Secondly, key segments of the military were very unhappy with what Allende was doing. They were very much tied in with the oligarchy. And finally, the United States government, the Nixon administration and Kissinger's State Department thought that Allende was a dangerous Marxist, and that if he were allowed to hold power, this would show the United States' willingness to allow far left governments. So the United States government quietly and behind the scenes, working with these groups, tried to destabilize things. And they thought that with midterm elections coming up, that they would gain. But in fact, Allende did really, really well in the midterm elections. He gained seats, which is pretty unheard of for a president to gain seats in a midterm election. But part of this was he was delivering. The very reforms he made ended up increasing workers' real income, the money they took home, by 50%. He dramatically expanded government health and education programs, and people really took advantage of those and liked those. So there was a real sense that these things, along with an agrarian reform that he was expanding and beginning to nationalize copper, that these would really, help Chile. And so he's incredibly popular among the vast majority of Chileans, but increasingly unpopular with the United States and the Chilean right. And it was after the midterm elections that the U.S. government moved into active opposition. By late 1971, the Nixon government moved to overthrow Allende. It pumped tremendous amounts of money into Chile to destabilize the economy and to pay off as many coup planners who would, work with the right to get rid of Allende. So the United States government, one of the things it could do is it could use the international financial system to hurt the Chilean economy, to cut off loans, to not allow it to get various benefits from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And it did start to hurt the Chilean economy. Economic growth stalled. The black market increased as producers kept goods off the market. There was a real mentality of shortages. And the right did a lot psychologically to convince people that things were worse than they were. So there were lots of stories planted in the press about horrible conditions and radical leftists. And by the way, some of the people in this party, the MIR, were involved in armed seizures of land that they would then turn over to peasants. Now, Allende opposed this and would give the land back, but the right did everything it could to kind of stoke fear of these things. And increasingly throughout 1972 and 1973, there's more and more confrontation within the society over what's going on. Workers were striking and peasants were challenging landowners, and there were even families that were quite divided. The opposition thought it would do well in a series of midterm elections, and they even thought, municipal elections, and they even thought that they would do so well in March 1973 congressional elections, some kind of by seats and so forth, that they would have enough people in the Congress to impeach Allende. But once again, Allende's party gained more and more seats. Now, members of the military did oppose Allende, but there was still a sense in the military that Chile should remain a democratic society. And there was a general who was the chief of staff who was against any attempt to overthrow things. And some coup planners decided what they were going to do was kidnap him dressed up like radical leftists and kind of, convince him and the more moderate members of the military to overthrow Allende. But this guy, whose name was General Schneider, was a pretty tough guy, and he fought his abductors, and they actually killed him by mistake. Now, it soon came out that he was killed by members of the military. Well, it took a while for that to come out. But what happened was Allende then turned to the next in line in the military, a man named Augusto Pinochet. And he thought Pinochet would maintain society. But Pinochet did not. With the backing of the United States government, he launched a vicious coup. And those are military men firing on the presidential palace. Those machine guns, they're literally shooting at the presidential palace. It was a full-blown military coup. And later, the Air Force dropped bombs on the presidential palace. And when the military won easily because it had all the arms, they rounded up people. You can see these people with hands behind their backs, and they dragged them off to a soccer stadium. Many of them were simply murdered. It was an incredibly vicious coup that had the full support of the United States government. Allende tried to fight, but he was obviously heavily outgunned, and the military seized power, ending Chile's long, long history of progressive politics, or at least the availability of progressive politics, and open and democratic politics. And this long dictatorship began on September 11th, 1973, and I'll talk about this in a future lecture, but he ended up leaving power after losing a plebiscite about whether or not he should stay in power in 1990. So this was a horrible right-wing government. We'll talk more about it later, but it was extremely violent. It ended any kind of government support for popular programs. It really destroyed Chilean society and had more negative consequences than anything else. But, there are lots of ways to read what happened in Chile, and there's a really sad way to read it, which is to say that maybe Castro was right, that the United States would not allow for a democratic path to reform, that Allende was to the left of Arbenz, but like Arbenz was a sincere Democrat and ended up being overthrown. Another obvious conclusion is that Chilean democracy was never quite as strong as Chileans thought it was. It was a central part of their identity to say we're the most democratic people in Latin America, but they pretty quickly abandoned democracy when the military came in. And all of this shows the real limits of reform in the Cold War era. That any attempt to get at the issues of how the economy was export-oriented and there was skewed distribution of income, tremendous distance between rich and poor, answering these things, trying to address them in the Cold War often led to vicious U.S. opposition. And finally, it really raises this question is, by the standards of the 1970s, people looked at Latin America, and we're going to talk about this in the next couple lectures, and said, maybe Latin America is incapable of democracy. If they can't have democracy in Chile, maybe democracy won't take place anywhere. Now, the good news is that Chile is a democracy today, as is almost all of Latin America. But from the vantage point of the 1970s and 1980s, this coup in 1973 was really incredibly depressing and seemed to say that all of the sort of structural issues in Latin America that we've talked about had made democracy an impossibility.